Hi, my name is EK, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I'm going to give you a vague history of England-ish. I am a history graduate. I've just finished my undergraduate degree in history and I'm about to embark on a postgraduate degree also in history. At the beginning of my degree I studied the arts kind of more generally. After that I then studied medieval and early modern Europe, and as my final two courses I studied European empires, particularly the British Empire, and also the medieval and early modern periods in Scotland. So these last two courses especially did widen my historical knowledge outside of England, both northward to Scotland and then looking at England and then Britain and how it was impacted by and impacted different countries around the world during periods of colonisation. Today I want to kind of give you a vague and disparate overview of some of the events that happened in medieval England, mainly revolving around the royal family. I have an outline kind of from 1066 all the way to Henry VIII in the 16th century, but today I'm actually going to cap this video probably around the 100 Years' War, which ended in the 15th century, because what better way is there to study English history than starting and ending in France? Depending on how long this video ends up being, it may not even get to the 100 Years' War, but even then it is not exhaustive at all, not by a long shot. This is just things that I vaguely knew off the top of my head. I wrote down a list of all of England's royals from William I and kind of thought, what do I know about these royals? What is it that I remember they were involved in? Then I just kind of checked the dates and the finer details. I would encourage you to seek voices that know about history beyond mine. I will put some links in the description, and I will also put a link to a charity that I've mentioned before called the Young Historians Project. The Young Historians Project aims to kind of improve engagement and participation in the field of history amongst young black kids and black teenagers. But for now we will take a little trip to the south coast of England in the autumn of 1066. I am going to do my makeup, or I'm going to try and do my makeup while I do this. I'm not very good at doing my makeup and talking at the same time, so we're just going to see how it goes. So the reason I'm starting in 1066 you may already have realised, and that is because it was the year of the Battle of Hastings, when a the Duke of Normandy, a man called William, basically came to England and defeated the Anglo-Saxon king, who was called Harold Godwinson. Yep, correct. And he won, basically. The Normans won, and they ended up becoming the ruling family of England. So the build-up to the battle is kind of complicated. I actually had to write a letter detailing what had happened for my history class in like year 8, so when I was about 11 or 12, and I tea stained the paper and then tried to like singe the edges to make it look old, and the whole thing caught fire and I had to redo it. The backstory is basically that the Anglo-Saxon King of England died without having any issue, and there was a big kerfuffle about who was going to follow him, and in the end William of Normandy, he was the Duke of Normandy, which is placed in northern France. He was the grandson of the uncle of the last king, so he was like, that means me, I get to be the king. Some people disagreed. He said fine, I'm going to invade, and he did. That's pretty much the long and short of it. It had a huge impact on England, and over the next few years the Anglo-Norman like conquest of England was kind of cemented. It also had an impact in Scotland because in the early 12th century a king called David became the King of Scotland, and his mother was English and he had spent time in England, and so he kind of brought back this Anglo-Norman culture to Scotland. So that's kind of all going pretty well, and the Anglo-Normans have settled in and become the ruling dynasty of England. After William, his son becomes king, also called William, and after that William dies, another of the first William's sons becomes king, and his name is Henry, so he rules as Henry I. In 1135 he dies, as you know people are wont to do, and you must think, oh well, that's not really a big deal because he'll just have a son and the son will take over, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, 15 years prior to Henry I's death, his son, his eldest son, also called Henry, there are a lot of Henrys in this, so just like maybe take some notes or something to try and keep them all straight, but I will be using I will be using the number that indicates which Henry they were, so to try and help you kind of keep it all together. Anyway, so Henry I's son is dead, but thankfully he has a daughter and he gets some of the nobility of England to swear to recognise the claim of his daughter, who's called Matilda, to the English throne. It basically says that you'll have to promise that after I die, you're going to make her queen and she's going to have a lovely time. So she's been living in Europe for a little bit. When she was 12, she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor. And when he died, she remarried to a man called Geoffrey Plantagenet, who was the Count of Anjou in France. So in 1135, when Henry I dies, Matilda's like, okay guys, you all promised me this crown, let's do it, let's crown me. And all of the English nobles are like, yeah, about that. No, we just don't fancy you being queen. And they instead crown Matilda's cousin, called Stephen. And so to kind of decide, to kind of settle the question of who was going to become the next monarch, they had a great big civil war, and it lasted quite a long time, and it was known as the Anarchy. There was a lot of back and forth. At one point, Matilda was actually named Lady of the English, so she wasn't quite crowned queen, but that seemed like it was going to happen. But at another point, Stephen, her cousin, she had managed to capture, but then she had to swap him for her half-brother, who had been captured by Stephen's wife, who was also called Matilda. So it kind of seems towards the middle of the 12th century that Stephen has won, and that he's going to be the king and Matilda is not going to be the queen. But Stephen's wife and his son die, and so he kind of says to Matilda, alright, you can't be queen, but I'm gonna like be dead soon, so how about your son becomes king after I die? And Matilda's like, okay, yeah, that's fine. So when he does die, Matilda's son, who is called Henry Plantagenet, becomes Henry II. But what happened to this Henry II, who now has become king, kind of won in the long term, I guess, the Anarchy? Well, two very important things happen involving him. Obviously there are more than two, but these are the two that I can remember. The first one is that he has a falling out with his friend Thomas. Thomas is a monk, he's called Thomas Becket, and basically they have a falling out, and at one point Henry II may or may not have said the phrase, "Who will rid me of this troublesome monk?" and somebody overheard and decided to rid him of that troublesome monk by murdering Thomas in Canterbury Cathedral. You can actually go and visit Canterbury Cathedral in Kent and see the exact place where he is said to have died. But Henry II was like, oh shit, I didn't mean for this to happen, was very upset, and in penance walked around barefoot for a bit. So the next interesting thing about Henry II involves his wife. He marries a Frenchwoman called Eleanor of Aquitaine, and before she marries Henry II, she actually is married to the French king, and they have two daughters together. But they kind of annul their marriage, and so she marries Henry and becomes the Queen Consort of England, and they have some more children together. I don't like it. It looks better on camera. They have three sons. One is called Henry, obviously, one is called Richard, and one is called John. But unfortunately, his eldest son, Henry, is getting really annoyed at his dad because his dad won't hurry up and die. So he's kind of like getting very impatient. He's like, I want the throne, I want more responsibilities, I want more money and shit. So Henry II is like, okay, you can have all this, and I'm going to formally invest you to show that you are the heir and that you will eventually be king, and you are going to be known as the young king, and that's going to sort everything and make everybody kind of stop squabbling. And it does not work. Instead, Henry, the young king, who is, you know, gunning to try and become Henry III as soon as possible, actually rebels against his father, and he does that with his younger brother Richard. I can't remember if John got involved, but Eleanor did get involved. She actually gets imprisoned by her husband for being part of this rebellion, and she is kept captive for like decades, and at one point she is actually kept at Sarum Castle, which is just down the road from me. So eventually Henry II did die, obviously, but by that point Henry the young king is already dead, so it's not really much use to him anymore. And instead Richard becomes the next king, and we know him as Richard the Lionheart. Now Richard the Lionheart didn't really give a fuck about England. He didn't really like it. He thought the weather was shit, and he spent all his time going on crusades in the Middle East. He actually ends up dying on crusade, and his younger brother, called John, becomes the next king. Now, you know John is a very snivelly lion from Robin Hood. In real life, he was not a lion, but he has been portrayed as kind of snivelly, because in 1215, all of the barons get really pissed off at him and make him sign something called the Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter, that basically says that John will stop being bothersome and annoying and have his royal powers curbed slightly somewhat. But John dies in 1216, a year after signing the Magna Carta, and his son, who is called Henry, becomes Henry III. And I don't know that much about Henry III, so we're going to skip him and go to his son, who is called Edward, and is known as Edward I of England. So I know a little bit more about Edward I than his father, and when you find out his nickname, you will understand why, because Edward I is sometimes known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, and as I have studied Scottish history, I ended up studying a little bit about Edward I. So Edward I, his kind of standout trait is wanting Scotland. At some point, like in the previous century or whatever, a king of Scotland had made some acknowledgement of England's overlordship to Scotland, and England was kind of calling in that debt and being like, you said that you would be loyal to us, which means I'm your king, so like get in line. And Scotland kind of said no, but in the 1290s their king, Alexander III, died, and he didn't have any kids. So Scotland agreed that his granddaughter, I think it was his daughter's daughter, so his daughter had married the King of Norway, and they'd had a daughter called Margaret, who was known as Margaret of Norway. She was going to come and become their queen, but she was really young, she was like 12 or 13, but it's like, it'll be fine, she'll come over, she'll love Scotland, except she dies on the journey over, and so now they don't have a king, they don't have an heir, they don't have anyone. So to prevent Scotland and Scotland's nobles from falling into civil war, they allow Edward I of England to come and be like the arbitrator in them establishing and kind of organising who is going to be the king. Edward is obviously like, this is a fantastic idea, I'm going to come and help you decide who is going to be your king. And there are three main candidates. One is John Balliol, or Balliol, I've only ever heard it pronounced in a Scottish accent, so I'm not sure. The second one is Robert de Brew, and the third one is a man called John Comyn. So we've got three candidates, and Edward picks the first one, John Balliol, and kind of uses him as a puppet king to rule Scotland according to English interests. So at this time, this is when William Wallace rebels against the English kind of regime. He wins the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but then a year later he is defeated at the Battle of Falkirk. Unfortunately, he is taken to London, where he is hanged, drawn and quartered as a traitor for treason, and his full body parts are then sent to different parts of the land. So kind of pretty grisly, if I'm being honest. So shortly after the dismemberment of William Wallace, the son of Robert de Brew, who we know as Robert the Bruce, so his father is called Robert de Brew, which means of Brew, it's French, and then his son is more commonly known as Robert the Bruce, and he rebels against England. So William Wallace is dead, but William Wallace was like a knight, he wasn't really a noble in the same way that Robert is, and Robert obviously has a claim through his father to the Scottish throne that was rejected by Edward I in favour of John Balliol's. Anyway, he's like, yep, I want to be king, let's get rid of these English people, and you know what, if you actually make me king, that's would be like a swell side effect. And at one point in 1306, he meets up with the aforementioned John Comyn in a church in Dumfries. So there were actually two John Comyns, and I've gotten the two confused. There was one who was like a claimant to the throne when Edward I was deciding who was going to be the King of Scotland, and then the John Comyn that I'm about to talk about was his son. We don't really know what Robert wanted out of this meeting, like why he said, you know, do you want to come and hang out in this church for the evening? And we don't actually know what they said to each other during that meeting, but what we do know is that by the end of it, John Comyn was dead on the altar. He had been stabbed possibly once by Robert and then by somebody else, who Robert came out of the church and was like, oh my god, I've stabbed him, and one of his friends was like, oh, I better go make sure he's actually dead then, because I mean, why not make it worse? But yeah, so he does that, he then gets excommunicated, but one of the bishops in Scotland is like, I'm gonna un-excommunicate you, you know, no big deal, because I want you to be my king. And shortly afterwards he is actually crowned king as Robert I. A year after that, a year after Robert is crowned, Edward I dies, and his son, called Edward, Prince Edward of Carnarvon, becomes Edward II. So over the next few years we now have Robert the Bruce, or Robert I of Scotland as he has been crowned. He sets about taking Scotland back from the English using what can only be really described as like guerrilla tactics, and the kind of set piece of this is in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Edward II's army, he's not actually there, but his army comes to Stirling to try and relieve the castle at Stirling, which is held by the English but being besieged by the Scots. And there's a huge battle, and it looks as if the English will win, like in terms of manpower, but they're actually really like roundly defeated by Robert the Bruce's army. And that didn't finish the war, and the wars of independence actually go on for a really long time. There's like peace treaties, and then they start fighting again, but the end result in the long term is that Scotland retains its independence. Robert's grandson, also called Robert, becomes Robert II eventually, and he kickstarts the Stuart dynasty of Scotland, who eventually will become the kings of England as well. So going back to England, Edward II is not doing too well. He's not a very popular ruler, and his wife Isabella is a French princess, and she is very, very ruthless, and she has a boyfriend called Roger. So in 1327, Roger and Isabella actually stage a coup to oust Edward II. They succeed, and they put Isabella and Edward's son, Edward III, he becomes king, but he's quite young, he's only like 15, so he has like Isabella ruling for him as a regent. As for Edward II, he becomes Deadwood II. That's a good joke. That's a good joke. He gets murdered quite brutally actually, so, you know, kind of less funny. Edward III, 3 years after this, actually has Roger Mortimer, I guess his stepdad, executed, and he takes his personal rule, which means regents aren't like ruling on his behalf. He is just ruling as like an adult, as a normal king. So the two most memorable parts of Edward III's rule, he rules for about 50 years, quite a long time. Obviously he was quite young when he became king, he was only 15. But he starts the 100 Years' War with France, which lasts for 116 years, obviously, and he also has a lot of kids. Like, he's probably one of the most fertile royals in English history. Oh, I don't know, actually, Elizabeth Woodville was popping them out like nobody's business. But the important thing about his kids is that a lot of them survive. The children of Edward III have their own Wikipedia page. He had 8 sons and 5 daughters, and most significantly, 5 of those sons and 1 of those daughters lives and has their own children as well. So what we kind of get is the descendants of Edward III and their descendants spend kind of the next 2 centuries in England just falling out with each other and squabbling. And eventually these squabbles kind of form the basis of the Wars of the Roses, but that is like, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. So we'll stay here for a moment and just deal with the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, or the beginnings of it at least, they kind of overlap a lot, so it might seem like I'm jumping back and forth a bit here, but to understand the context of like this chronology and why things are happening when they're happening, you do kind of need to like straddle the two subjects. So just bear with me. The King of France, Charles IV, dies, and Charles IV's sister is Isabella of France, Edward III's mother, the one who staged the coup. So Edward III claims the throne of France through that connection. He says, I'm the nearest kind of male relative to Charles IV, he's now dead, so I would like the throne, thank you very much. The French say, no, thank you, we're going to crown Charles IV's cousin, who is called Philip VI. So Edward III insists that no, he is the King of France, and he begins styling himself as such and his titles as the King of France. He also incorporates the fleur-de-lis, which is the royal symbol of France, into his coat of arms. And it actually isn't until after the French Revolution, so after the monarchy in France is abolished and then brought back and then abolished and whatever, it is only then that the kings of what is then Britain, George III, actually agrees to stop calling himself the King of France. The Jacobite pretenders to the throne continue saying they are the King of France, but I mean, in reality, they ain't the king of anything, so nobody's that bothered like about their opinion in this time. So most of the best bits about the 100 Years' War, and by best bits I mean the bits I studied and know about, they actually happened in the 1400s. So for a moment we're going to head back to the prolific loins of Edward III and the produce of those ridiculously fertile gonads. So 2 of the really important kind of memorable sons that Edward III has is one called Edward, obviously, Edward of Woodstock. He is the oldest, so he's going to hopefully be Edward IV. And he is known to us as the Black Prince. He wasn't called it at the time. He was known as Edward of Woodstock at the time. The reason he is not known as Edward IV to us is because he died before his father Edward III died. So he is the heir of Edward III, and after he dies it goes to his son, who is called Richard. And Richard becomes king when he is only 10 years old. So one of Edward III's other sons is one called John, and he's the Duke of Lancaster, and he's actually born in Ghent, which is in Belgium. But instead of calling him John of Ghent, where he was from, we anglicise it to John of Gaunt, and that is how you may have come across him previously. So when Edward III dies, his grandson Richard becomes king. He becomes Richard II. Because he's so young, because Richard II is only 10 when he becomes king, he is ruled by regents, so other people are in charge for him. But when he is about, I think, 14 or something, there is the Peasants' Revolt, which took place in 1381, and it was basically the peasants revolting. They marched on London. They actually took London. I think they took the Tower of London, and they demand to speak to their young king, and they want to talk to him, and they want to tell him their demands. And he agrees to this, and he meets them and kind of listens to them and is like, yeah, what do you want? And once the royal forces have re-established control, they then ignore every demand they made and set about executing some of the leaders. So Richard II kind of survives this crisis, but 6 years later he is deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, and Henry Bolingbroke's father is John of Gaunt. So Henry becomes king, he becomes Henry IV, and he is actually the first English king since 1066 to speak English as his first language, his mother tongue, rather than French. So Henry IV has a son, also called Henry, who becomes Henry V in 1413. Now at this point, the hostilities between the French and the English are really kind of ramping up. And by this point, there are even factions in France who wouldn't really mind if the English won, because the King of France, oh my god, this is really pigmented, I've not used this before. Oh lord, what have I done? Oh lord, what was I even fucking talking about? Oh yeah, Charles VI. So Charles V isn't really very well. He has kind of periods of mental instability, and so for this faction at court, who are the Burgundians, the Duke of Burgundy and his kind of allies and family, they see Charles VI's illness as a way to kind of seize power. Because the king can't really rule in his own right, so other people are going to be ruling for him and having power over him. So the Burgundians and the English kind of ally together and are like, you know, we can help each other out here, so that England, you know, will hopefully get a little bit closer to their claims of being the kings of France, and in return the Burgundians can kind of have more influence in those corridors of power within the French royal government. So in 1415 there is a battle. It's called the Battle of Agincourt, and the English win under Henry V. They win quite spectacularly, and 5 years later a treaty is signed between the English and French crowns, but the French crown is kind of under the influence of the Duke of Burgundy, and this treaty is called the Treaty of Troyes, or Troyes, I can't bloody pronounce it, I took French for like 6 years, but whatever. This treaty says that once Charles VI dies, Henry V and his descendants will become the King of France. So they've won. The English have won, basically. 2 years later, Charles VI does die, and it's time now for Henry V to become King of England and France, except a few weeks later he also dies. So a very short-lived victory. So Henry V did have a son and an heir, but he was only an infant. He was about 9 months old when he gets crowned as Henry VI. And obviously this treaty was taking into account Henry V's heirs, his children, so Henry VI should be recognised by this treaty as the King of France. But Charles VI did have children of his own, and he had 2 sons. One of them has already died by this point, but the next one, also called Charles, obviously the French are just as creative as we are in naming their royals, he is still alive, and he's kind of chilling further south in France, trying to retake France, his kingdom, from both the Burgundians and the English. But the Prince, Charles, finds himself quite an unexpected ally, a teenage peasant girl from a place called Domremy, who we know as Joan of Arc. She makes her way through enemy territory to the prince's camp, to like his stronghold kind of thing, and basically says, I'm going to make you king and I'm going to help you defeat the English. And she pretty much does. They fight their way to the traditional cathedral where the French kings are coronated, and she crowns him. You know, she does exactly what she says she did. It does take a little bit longer than that to fully retake France, but within a couple of decades, by the 1450s, France has won, and England actually loses all of the territory that it held in France, except for the town of Calais, which holds out for about another century until it gets lost under Mary I. But that's for another video. Joan, however, is not around to see this. She's been dead for about 20 years. In 1430, she gets captured by the Burgundians, and then they ransom her off to the English, where she is tried and executed for heresy. In the meantime, Charles VII, who has become king partly due to her efforts, doesn't lift a finger to help her, which, you know, kind of a dick move. So that is the end of the 100 Years' War. I have really enjoyed doing this. I hope it kind of edits together well, but we shall see. I shall see. If you have any questions about stuff that I've talked about today, or any other like aspects of history that I may know about, or may be able to point you in the direction of somebody who does know, please let me know in the comments. In the description, I'm going to put some resources, hopefully for stuff where I've found this information, and I'm also going to put a link to the Young Historians project that I mentioned at the beginning. So if you have a couple of spare quid going this month, maybe chuck some of it that way. I hope you have a lovely day. I hope you're all staying safe out there, washing your hands, etc. And I will see you in my next video. And in return, alright, it's not fucking Bala Britain, calm down.